A large, well-iced cake, neatly divided into 7 slices. The 7 slices represent territories claimed by Argentina, Chile, Britain, France, Norway, New Zealand, and by Australia. And you can easily see that Australia has laid claim to by far the largest proportion of the surface area of the Antarctic. We claim some 42% of the Antarctic as our own. That's an area of some 6 million square kilometres, or about the combined area of Western Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland. The flags on the map represent bases which are maintained essentially for research purposes by a number of nations, not all of whom recognise the validity of the divisions outlined in this cut-up cake. But that's a matter for some debate. The nature of the treaty itself, in fact, is coming under discussion at the moment. It's seen by some to be anachronistic, even discriminatory. Now, we'll talk more about that in the program. We have a panel of experts gathered here tonight to discuss this. But first of all, I'd like to welcome to the studio a man who is a veteran of dozens of expeditions to the Antarctic, a man who has established a reputation as a remarkable leader of men working under what must at times be the most appalling conditions on the planet. Dr. Phillip Law, thank you for joining me tonight. Dr. Law, to someone like myself who's not been to the Antarctic, inescapably anyone like yourself who's been there many times, worked there and returned, fits into my category of a hero. Now, I know you're not comfortable with the title of hero, and nor are you comfortable with the concept of heroism with regard to modern Antarctic research. Why is that?
I think the most heroic thing you do is to volunteer to go. After that, everything just falls into place, and if you get out on a limb, you have to get back.
Right.
And that's where the so-called heroism comes in.
Has there been a shift in the way expeditions are mounted over the years?
I think there's too much talk today of the adventure having left Antarctica. There's just as much adventure as there ever was. The minute you leave the safety of your station or your vehicle, you're in potential difficulty.
Right.
The old expeditions got into lots more trouble, and therefore they had what seemed much more heroic adventures. Certainly they had the psychological problem, like climbing Everest first. The first time off is always harder than the ones you follow.
But surely the spirit of heroism was what led to the dividing up of this cake of Antarctica, as we've called it. What were the circumstances in which Australia laid claim to this massive quadrant?
Australia's claim depends on a lot of early heroic British exploration that went on, plus the 2 big explorations of Sir Douglas Mawson, one in 1911-13, the other 1929-31.
Right, and
following the second expedition, Britain handed over to Australia a claim, and the Australian government accepted and put that claim in place.
Right, and so we see film here of Mawson actually planting the flag in what, 1929?
That was, I think, 1930.
1930,
yes.
Right. Fine, well, look, thank you very much. We'll now move across and join the rest of our guests over here in the other set. I'd like to come this way. Well, now with me in the studio tonight, Dr. Gillian Triggs, who's a senior lecturer in law and who's made a detailed investigation of the legal aspects of the Antarctic Treaty. Professor Bill Budd, who's a meteorologist and glaciologist with an interest in the Antarctic and has visited there a number of times. Dr. Paul Broady, who's a botanist and a member of an organisation known as Antarctic Action, and Mr. John Reynolds, who's representing Western mining and represents, of course, the voice of industry in the future of the Antarctic. Well, Dr. Law, 1957 to 58 was the year of the International Geophysical Year, and that's been termed by many a point of major revolution in the history of the Antarctic. Why is that?
I think the heroic expeditions, although they're very well known, did not explore the major part of Antarctica. The major exploration took place from the 1940s onward, and particularly during and after the IGY.
Right.
And that was the period in which the major scientific assault was made on Antarctica also. So the IGY really is the beginning of the massive attack on Antarctica.
Right. And it's also about that time that the Antarctic Treaty came into being. What was the mood at the time in which the treaty came into existence?
I think there are 2 things. First, the claims situation had caused a certain amount of friction, which was undesirable. The IGY period had shown remarkable international amity and cooperation. And at the end of the IGY, it was felt that that should be continued, and the treaty grew out of that.
Right, so it was a feeling, in fact, of perhaps optimism, concern for the Antarctic, and cooperation.
And desire to continue what had proved a very useful exercise.
And in your view, does that attitude persist today?
Oh yes, yes, very much.
Right, fine. Dr. Triggs, surely the Antarctic represents a special case in terms of legal situations on the grounds that it was uninhabited when first populated. It's terra nullius, I believe is the expression. Is there a special legal significance to the treaty in terms of this special case?
Well, the treaty itself attempts to establish a sort of status quo. It's quite a remarkable document in that regard, in that it did put on ice the conflicts that Dr. Law is talking about. But the conflicts derived from claims to territorial sovereignty within Antarctica, which in turn raised rather interesting questions for international lawyers as to the ways in which states can acquire territorial sovereignty over territory which is owned by no one.
Right, yeah. How does the treaty stand up today as a legal document?
Well, there's no doubt that in the last 25 years or so, the treaty has been a remarkably successful international organisation. The difficulty, however, is that that organisation is now under threat, because the vast bulk of the international community now argues that they too have interests in the area and they want a decision-making role in the future of the Antarctic region.
Right.
Perhaps within the context of the treaty, or perhaps within the context of a broader United Nations organisation.
So the effectiveness of the treaty is now somewhat doubted, perhaps, by what you're saying?
Well, the validity of it, in a sense, is doubted, because many of the developing states particularly didn't exist as states at the time the Antarctic Treaty was negotiated, and they're arguing that as a matter of law they're entitled to a role in the future management of Antarctica.
The treaty has been described, or I've heard it described, as a masterly case of contrived ambiguity. Do you think that's perhaps one of its strengths?
Oh, indeed. It provides great fun for lawyers, but there's no doubt that it's been extremely successful. This contrived ambiguity, or bifocalism as others refer to it, allow the various parties to view the provisions within the treaties and linked documents in the way most suited to their particular legal position. Now that seems horrifying to anybody who wants to bring the matter before a court for an objective determination, but there's no doubt that it achieved the purpose of allowing scientists really to get on with the work they're interested in pursuing.
Yes. Now, of course, the relevance has been questioned, particularly, I gather, by developing countries such as Malaysia, Sierra Leone. And this leads us to a concept of a common heritage. The nations that are developing feel that if there is a treasure trove of wealth in the Antarctic, then they would like their fair share. Now, what are the legalistic problems in that?
The concept of a common heritage means all things to all people and all states, it seems. The Antarctic Treaty parties argue that indeed they are preserving Antarctica in the interests of mankind. Developing states argue that that's not the case at all. Common heritage means common ownership and denies individual claims to sovereignty, and of course Australia's claim. And there are various positions in between. Nonetheless, of course, the concept has enormous political significance.
Yes. Dr. Law, how do you feel about the concept of a common heritage for the Antarctic?
I believe that there are two major problems in the future of Antarctica. One is, do you exploit it or don't you? The second is, whether you exploit it or not, what is the regime of control that you're going to establish? And I believe it's possible to establish a regime of control by the treaty organisation which would still satisfy the heritage of man concept.
We have an interview actually made just the other day with the Australian ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Richard Woolcott. And in that interview he outlined the Australian government's stance on Antarctica to Toni Steinbrecher. Well, yeah.
Mr. Woolcott, how important is Antarctica to Australia?
Well, I think Antarctica is a very important national interest to Australia. Firstly, as you know, the Australian government maintains a claim to some of the Antarctic territory, and secondly, of course, Australia is proximate to Australia. It's immediately to our south, so it has a strategic importance to us. and we have a long history of exploration and scientific research in Antarctica.
How unlikely are we to move away from the present treaty situation, which has now been challenged by Malaysia and Sierra Leone in the United Nations?
I think we're highly unlikely to move away from the present treaty situation. In fact, the thrust of our policy at the moment is to reinforce the treaty and to strengthen the treaty.
What about the question, though, of common heritage? Shouldn't it be the right of every nation to have access and to have a say on what has basically been and still is really an uninhabited land?
Well, there were several problems about the application of the common heritage of mankind principle to Antarctica. Now, it has been applied, of course, to outer space and indeed to the deep seabed. But outer space surrounds us all. Deep seabed has not been subject to any claims, but Antarctica is a sort of finite continent with boundaries, and whether or not territorial claims are accepted, it's a fact of life that 7 countries have laid claim to different parts of Antarctica. And given that fact, it's very, very difficult to conceive of applying the common heritage of man principle to Antarctica. Secondly, the common heritage principle has an exploitive connotation. What it means that if there are riches there, you share them. Now, I think the thrust of our policy, certainly, is the protection of the environment, not the exploitation of any possible future resources.
Of course, setting that statement up into a legalistic framework must be a fairly complex procedure. I gather the law of the sea was set up to achieve much the same end and yet proved to be rather unwieldy in practice. Is that fair?
Well, we don't know yet because the Law of the Sea Convention is not yet in force, although I'm a great optimist and think it probably will be. But I think a point that's worth making is that Mr. Woolcott raises the question of outer space and the deep sea bed. There's no doubt that the concept of common heritage does apply. It has real and specific meaning within the terms of the relevant treaties. But he's also correct in saying that one can't automatically make the analogy with Antarctica, quite simply because it's been subject to claims to sovereignty. The defect in this position that he's putting, a position that's put by all of the claimant states and some of the Antarctic Treaty parties, is that those claims are based on what are arguably now outdated international legal principles. The second point one might make is that while the notion of a common heritage is admittedly rather emotive in the context of Antarctica, it has a political value such that it might ultimately become the law in a dynamic system of international law.
I guess, interestingly enough, it's one of those treaties which has provided a section of the globe which is the most demilitarised section of the globe, perhaps in history.
Well, that is one of the many respects in which it's been extremely successful.
Mr. Woolcott went on to talk about his view of the effectiveness of the treaty as compared to the possibility of United Nations committees running the Antarctic. So let's have a look at the next film clip of this interview.
After 2.5 years in New York, working both in the United Nations and being the chairman of the New York group of the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties, I've come to the conclusion that the United Nations system tends to work less effectively than I had hoped it would, while the Antarctic Treaty system works more effectively than I had expected it would. And I feel that the fundamental issue is this: could the United Nations provide an institution or an arrangement which would regulate the future of Antarctica more effectively than the treaty does? And my answer to that would have to be no.
Yes, and of course the key issues seem to be coming out, the question of management of the Antarctic and the question of exploitation of resources down there, and the two are really very much intertwined. But let's move now to Professor Budd. Professor Budd, politicians talk of the vast wealth of the Antarctic, a kind of treasure trove hidden away beneath the ice. But is this true? Is this a misapprehension, or is it... What wealth is there in the Antarctic?
Yes, I think it needs to be understood in terms of the use of the Antarctic for scientific research, for which it is very valuable indeed. It's another continent which shows us, in the case of the rocks, how the rocks are related, how they were related in the past when the continents were joined together, how the sediments were laid down. In the other fields, how the atmosphere works, how the weather and climate of the whole globe is dependent on what's happening in the Antarctic area. These things are most valuable. It gives us the idea of basic research and how basic research leads to discoveries in other areas, and that can be much more valuable than the discoveries themselves.
Right, so in an ideal world, in your ideal world, you'd like to see the Antarctic as a giant science lab with scientists having the only keys.
Well, that is the way the activities in the Antarctic are going at present. The major interest in the Antarctic is a way of finding out more about our planet so we can better manage our planet for the benefit of all.
But what do we know really of the mineral resources there? I mean, there must be, or perhaps there are, perhaps there aren't, massive mineral resources, hydrocarbons. Given the position of, for example, the portion of the Antarctic which is closest to Australia, and given the findings of large mineral resources and hydrocarbon deposits, say in Bass Strait, and the fact that this was once contiguous land, now surely there's a fairly high probability of finding the same kinds of minerals and resources in the Antarctic adjoining segment.
That's true, but it needs to be put in perspective in the sense that although the Antarctic is a large continent, it is largely covered by ice, and the difficulty of obtaining anything from any small quantities of materials that are found there are very difficult and need to be considered in any future use of the minerals or whatever is found.
Sure. Given that the Antarctic is covered with, or locks up in the ice, something like 70% of the world's supply of fresh water, surely in a world which is becoming progressively drier, desertification seems to be spreading across the major continents. Isn't it very likely that in a fairly short time, water itself will become a key commodity to be exploited?
That's true. At least it needs to be investigated, and that again is part of the objectives of the scientific research being carried out in the Antarctic. And if we find, for example, that we can harvest the icebergs as water resources, then this certainly should be considered if it can be of great value to us in countries such as Australia. And the present indications are that that sort of resource is so far the most prospective envisaged for the Antarctic.
Right. But even that would have consequences. I seem to recall from seeing satellite pictures that the thing that you see first when you look at a polar view of the Earth from satellite is a large white, for all intents and purposes, mirror. Now surely that has a very important effect, the mirror-like effect of the ice reflecting rays back from the surface. What would be the effect, for example, of removing the ice and leaving a large brown and heat-absorbing landmass?
Well, again, that's the purpose for the scientific research being carried out, to understand these things. But in the case of the ice, we already know a lot about that, because we know the quantity of icebergs that are coming from the continent in general terms. We know also how they move about in the ocean currents. We also know roughly how they melt and how they break up and become mixed with the surface waters of the ocean. In the case of harvesting icebergs, all that would be involved would be that we'd collect some of these drifting icebergs of the appropriate size and shape and tow them to the destination for harvesting.
With a very large liner, yeah.
Or heavy tug or
heavy
icebreaker.
Tug, yeah, right. Moving to Mr. Reynolds, from the points that Professor Budd's been making, given that only 2% of the Antarctic is free of ice, so we have very small access sites to the substratum, if you like, and given that there's an average depth of ice of something like 1,800 metres, surely this must present horrendous difficulties for people wanting to get down there to even find out if there are minerals there in the first place. What then is the interest of industry in research in the Antarctic?
Well, you're quite right, there are horrendous difficulties, but nevertheless at present the membership of the Antarctic Treaty are occupying themselves with some very extensive negotiations about what they call a minerals regime, which is to account as to how things would be handled if and when some members or some nations or an international body decided that it wished to exploit non-renewable or mineral resources. I guess they're doing this because they believe there is some potential, either for hard rock minerals or for petroleum. As far as the Australian industry is concerned, we believe that the potential of the Antarctic is something for the quite distant future, if ever. We believe this because we have abundant resources in Australia at present. The world is by no means short of mineral resources. In fact, there's a great abundance.
And so it's a long-term strategy.
So that we believe that because there's this abundance and lots of potential for more discoveries in Australia, for example, that the difficulties and the unattractive parts of the Antarctic scene make us rather reticent to be very positive about minerals in the
What
Antarctic.
sort of research effort are mineral companies putting into the Antarctic? What's the...
I don't know of any specific or well-directed research efforts. I think what the mining industry is doing is just maintaining contact with the geologists that are carrying out pure geological research there.
Right.
Perhaps on the basis of extending our knowledge of the formation of minerals and their association in rocks.
There's always the risk, of course, of the Alaskan parallel, the fact that the Russians signed away Alaska to the US and then at some later date discovered that it was fairly well loaded with valuable resources.
Well, I think this is perhaps behind the thinking of the treaty membership, because the Alaskan purchase, I think, was made in 1867 from the Russians. Many Americans said this was folly to spend all that money buying this useless piece of land, and but as it's turned out, it's become a very valuable resource in the North American area. So that the future is so indefinite that I think that in respect of the Antarctic, we should prepare ourselves for all sorts of eventualities.
Sure.
And the more we prepare, the more likely are those things to be acceptable to the world community.
So in terms of Professor Budd's science laboratory, you'd like to have a set of keys too, but you wouldn't use them for some time?
Yes, we can't see any short term. It must be decades or even generations away before we believe the Antarctic would be of interest for hard rock. Maybe for petroleum, someone may become interested a little earlier, but again, the problems are extremely great.
Do you see the persistence of the Antarctic Treaty in its present terms, which restricts essentially to a relative, I think 31 nations are now signatories to the treaty. Do you see that as the best way to manage it, or would you rather see, say, a UN committee or a common heritage type committee formed?
Well, this is a matter really for the diplomats and the politicians to determine, but I think we're interested in and perhaps able to advise to some extent on the workability of a regime. If it is the will of the international community that a minerals regime should be developed, we can perhaps help in saying, well, this is a workable arrangement, but this will defeat its own purpose. And I think, as Gillian Triggs has mentioned, this sort of problem has arisen in the law of the sea, affecting the exploitation of deep seabed minerals.
Yes. Moving to Dr. Broady, in the terms of exploitation in the Antarctic, do you think there is something special about the Antarctic that should preclude any exploitation?
Well, yes, certainly the conservation movement believes that the whole of Antarctica ought to be preserved for future generations, completely free from any minerals activity. We believe that the environment down there is far too fragile to allow this sort of development to take place, whether it's in the medium term or probably in the long term.
Let's expand on that. When you say it's extremely fragile, what do you mean specifically? I mean, you've worked down there on the few plant species that live on the Antarctic. So what is the fragility?
Right, the wildlife in Antarctica perhaps can be divided into two sections. There's the life on the continent itself, which is very impoverished.
Right.
There are a few mosses, a few lichens, a few very tiny animals, none larger than about 2 or 3 millimeters in length. This life is very slow growing. Any damage done to it, the damage would take centuries probably to recover.
Right.
In the oceans, admittedly, we've got huge populations of marine animals. We've got the penguins, the seals. There are still large whale populations. The danger we see there is possibly greatest from the thought of what an oil spill could do.
Right, yeah.
Most of those animals spend a lot of time at the surface of the oceans. We just wonder what would happen to them if there was a significant oil spill in an area.
Yeah,
they obviously would be damaged by oil at the surface of water.
I guess the worry would be that pollutants of various sorts would move through the food web. Would that not be restricted, though, to the southern oceans? Wouldn't a spill in Antarctica simply damage a small portion of that ocean down there, or is there a more widespread problem?
Certainly it would be restricted to Antarctica, but the Antarctic animals are restricted to the Southern Ocean. If an oil spill occurred in the vicinity of a penguin rookery, penguins going out to sea to feed in that area would be very heavily affected. Likewise, so would seals if an oil spill occurred within an area of a concentration of seals.
As I understand it, the major link with the rest of the world from the Antarctic is through a bottom current which runs up across the Southern Ocean and then links and, for example, provides nutrients to the whole west coast of Australia. It would seem to me that that's a fairly important thing to be careful of protecting, even if it's a long time course thing.
Yes, I would imagine if there was very major damage to the Southern Ocean ecosystem, perhaps there would be changes in nutrient balances, which perhaps could affect more northerly regions. But I think the major concern is for those populations actually in Antarctica. And damage is taking place now, albeit on a local scale. There certainly is damage to the environment occurring locally around stations, and we don't want to see this sort of thing spread, which I imagine it would if a large-scale industry did develop.
You must be referring to sewage, for example, or
sewage, rubbish, damage to landscape. Any mark made on exposed rock and ground in Antarctica is there to stay. I've seen marks made by vehicles which are 10 years old. You'll see a line across the landscape where the vehicle has driven, and that mark is exactly as it was made 10 years ago.
Well, how then do we regulate this? How do we conduct scientific research to increase understanding of the Antarctic or to discover what is there without leaving tracks?
There are guidelines laid down, quite strict guidelines laid down under the Antarctic Treaty. And as has already been mentioned, the Antarctic Treaty was set up to encourage scientific activity, to encourage international cooperation and to control scientific activity. It was not set up to control mining activity.
Right, yeah. I wonder what the legal side of that is. Dr. Triggs, if somebody spills some oil in the Antarctic, or something else, or leaves an old Jeep down there, what is the legal position? Who's responsible for that?
Well, I'm afraid your question really does expose the vacuum in jurisdiction in Antarctica. If one were to see the position from the point of view of the claimant states, then obviously the claimant states would have jurisdiction to regulate matters within their territory, and interestingly, also within their maritime zones, their continental shelves, exclusive economic zones as well. If you deny those claims to sovereignty, then one would say, well, jurisdiction really rests with the state of which the offending party is a national. But there are certain provisions in the treaty itself in relation to jurisdiction, but none that would specifically cover this question.
Yes.
So it really becomes a matter for the treaty parties themselves to react to the issue, as indeed they have done to a degree with codes of conduct, certain environmental provisions. The challenge really for the Antarctic Treaty parties is to show that they can continue to put aside the question of sovereignty and the sort of nasty legal arguments that I was just adverting to, and devise recommendations which will be effective and will have an effect to regulate that kind of pollution.
But surely this is possible now because the importance of the Antarctic is perhaps still some time off in the future. If with developing countries starting to apply pressure to reorganise the status quo, surely that's going to sort of force the issue.
Oh, indeed, and I think Mr. Woolcott made the point that the Antarctic Treaty in the future must start to revise itself if it is to put off the challenge from within the United Nations. Now, it can do that partly by expanding its access to decision-making, which is a very significant issue as far as the developing states are concerned. Also by expanding the access to information. But I believe that if the Antarctic Treaty parties do so with a spirit of expanding knowledge and information and decision-making power, then it might be possible to rigorously continue to protect the Antarctic environment.
Right, yeah. One point that's been raised, or one potential concept that's been raised, is the concept of a kind of world park. Now, I guess you would be a supporter of the concept of a world park.
Oh, certainly, yeah. The conservation movement, pretty well worldwide, is very heavily behind a regime being negotiated under the auspices of the Antarctic Treaty, which will provide protection for the whole of the continent.
Right.
To keep it free from minerals activity.
And so the basis of this would be something like the rules that apply in national parks. If you pack it in, pack it out, and so on, who would have
yes, yeah.
access to this world park?
Hopefully there would be very strict management of the area. The area could be zoned in a similar way to the Barrier Reef Park off coast of Queensland in New South Wales, where different zones, different activities were allowed.
Yeah.
There may be areas where tourism, restricted tourism, controlled tourism was allowed, an area for science, and maybe another area where absolutely no activity at all was allowed. That's the sort
David,
of management.
If I could just make a comment, I can
Yes.
appreciate Paul's concern about the environmental situation in Antarctica and its special problems and its great sensitivities. In the northern hemisphere, and I'm not sufficiently expert to judge how close these are, and I guess there are a lot of differences, but in the northern hemisphere there are actual mining operations within the Arctic Circle, and there is one particular operation that the Canadians have, which is at latitude 77, which would, I think, place it roughly in the middle of the Antarctic land mass. It's a very long way down. This seems to be quite a successful operation and has been under strict environmental surveillance, but is nevertheless a commercial concern which has been going for some time. I'm not saying that that means, therefore, that mining can take place in the Antarctic, but I think the community probably wants to consider the question of whether you lock off an area and tie it up in perpetuity, never to be touched,
Yes.
or whether you adopt a flexible approach so that you can protect the environment, do the research in order to achieve that,
Dr. Law has
and
written
perhaps move into a flexible regime in the very long term.
I don't think the comparison with the Arctic is entirely valid. In the
No, that
Arctic
probably is so,
and
yeah.
in the regions where there is an oil industry, there are large areas of ice-free land. In Antarctica, the ice-free land is limited to about 1 or 2% of the whole continent. And the ice-free land around the fringes of the continent, where most of the marine organisms are concentrated, the penguin colonies, seals coming out onto the land, that area is much less than 1%, and it's on those areas that the infrastructure to support possibly an oil or mineral industry will develop. So the infrastructure will be concentrated where there are concentrations of these marine animals, and hence there could be great impact in those areas.
Sure. Dr. Law, you've written about the Antarctic, and you've written about the history of the Antarctic, and you recognise 4 phases of development, if I understand you correctly.
4 options.
4 options.
I think there are 4 possibilities, the major ones, for setting up a control regime. The first is to have a world wilderness or a world park, as Dr. Broady is proposing. The second is to have control by the claimant nations, which frankly I don't think is on. The third one is to have control by the United Nations, and I agree with Ambassador Woolcott that I don't think that is a very desirable way of going about it. And the fourth way is to have control by some sort of consortium of the treaty nations. The problem with that is that it would have to be some sort of international control commission or numbers of commissions, and I think it would only happen if, first of all claims were resigned.
Yes.
Now, I think the claimant nations, even though they might, as New Zealand, be prepared to give up their claim if they saw a better idea, most of them don't want to move until the better idea is pretty concrete.
Yes.
And I believe the Australian attitude would be to hang on to its claim until such time as something better emerges.
Yes.
And I believe that it is possible, as I said before, to have a consortium of the treaty nations that would handle it very well, because they so far have made Antarctica the best conserved continent in the world. I believe with Paul that you ought to be able to set up regions of different activities. But I think any attempt to completely rope off Antarctica in perpetuity is doomed to failure, because we are coming to a crunch point in the world's resources. The world's population will double in another 40 or 50 years. The developing nations are needing more and more resources. Everyone is after resources. And as they become more and more scarce, and as the price goes up, attention will be devoted to Antarctica, and when that crunch comes, no legal bit of paper is going to stop them going there.
Sure. But, Dr. Law, how long would the resources in Antarctica last? Wouldn't it just be a short-term solution? Hasn't the long-term solution got to be sought elsewhere?
I think so, but that's a question you can't very well answer. It's a continent 1.5 times as big as Australia. What is there and what technology can produce from it is a completely unknown question at the present time. In terms of oil, petroleum products, most of it looks as though it would come off the continental shelf, and that's a whole new ball game again because it's out in the ocean and not on the land itself.
But what would happen to Antarctica if industries like that developed there? You're now talking about removing ice from the ice cap to get at the oil. That would cause...
No, I was talking about getting it out in the oceans off the continental shelf. I know there are immense difficulties. I also believe that your technology can control the situation so that this fear of massive oil spills is not something we need worry too much about. I think we've got to spend a lot of time and technology preparing for it and trying to prevent it. Likewise, I hope we spend the next 50 years designing all the control mechanisms to protect the environment that need to be put in place before any of this starts. We can't let it start.
There's always the possibility of error, though, and errors of that sort taking place in Antarctica could cause much more damage than perhaps they would cause elsewhere.
Why is that?
Because we mentioned the fragility of the environment down there, and also because other continents have been affected by human errors of this sort in the oil industry and in other industries. In Antarctica, we've got a region where this hasn't happened yet. Can't we keep this last continent on Earth free from the possibility of that sort of thing happening? Even now, with science taking place in Antarctica, human error takes place now. Yes. There are accidents. There was oil spilt, or there was petrol spilt on the most valuable lake in Antarctica this summer during a parachute drop of fuel to Vanda Station.
Right.
There's a lake there called Lake Vanda, and parachutes failed to open and oil was spilt over the surface of the lake. It's that sort of thing we don't want to see happen on a larger scale.
And I guess one area that's fairly important to think about too is the strategic use. I gather Article 1.1 in the treaty actually prevents or suggests that the Antarctic should only be used for peaceful purposes and not for the deployment of weapon systems or surveillance systems or whatever.
Just one thing I'd like to say in relation to Paul's statement, and that is we must keep this in some sort of proportion. You can have an oil spill, okay. Even though you try to prevent it, it could happen. It could cause local trouble. But you'd think of a continent 1.5 times the big of Australia and think of the effect of an oil spill in Tasmania on the Gulf of Carpentaria or the Northern Kimberleys. This is the sort of exaggeration that I wouldn't like people to get away with.
Right.
But I believe in certain areas of Antarctica there are these circular currents in the seas. In the Ross Sea there's a circular gyre, a current that goes round and round. And apparently there has been a study which suggests that an oil spill in that area...
Oh, and there's a westerly drift right around the continent, we know that.
Well, just talking about the Ross Sea, perhaps oil spilt in that area would remain within the Ross Sea for a long period. And decomposition takes place very slowly in the cold waters of Antarctica, so perhaps oil could remain up on the surface of that sea for long
periods. I appreciate all
periods.
this, but I still don't think that any of those arguments will prevail if mankind begins to find his quality of life degenerating through lack of resources. He's going to go in and take it.
Well,
so our job is to try and make sure that all the rules are in place before that happens.
We believe that the quality of life is degenerating because of the destruction of wilderness areas. The quality of life for mankind as a whole.
Yes, I'd agree with you there.
Yes, and Antarctica is the last large wilderness area on Earth, and we would like to see it kept as such.
It seems we've reached a point of some disagreement. I think it really is time to wind up this discussion at this point, unless you have further remarks to make. Anyone would like to make remarks to add a final statement on their stance?
I'd just like to make a quick one.
Yes.
And that is, you mentioned the problem of non-militarisation,
Yes,
the fact that nuclear weapons may not be used or tested in the area. There's been a great deal of emphasis on the problem of mineral resource exploitation and the difficulties, but I wonder really whether it wouldn't be better to throw out notions like common heritage and sovereignty as sort of buzzwords and start to think about what nations' interests in Antarctica are. And once you start to emphasise the non-militarisation, the free scientific access to information, interest in security, interests in fishing conservation, then I think you start to sort of pull out or tease out some of the interests which are common to all states, and indeed I think including those states which at present maintain a sovereignty claim.
Can I add one word?
Please,
Is it on?
please do.
I said that I believe the consortium of treaty nations could handle the heritage of man concept. That's because any control mechanism would have to grant licenses, but it would also have to extract royalties, just as any nation does from mining companies in its bounds. Those royalties, then, the consortium would have to distribute. And when you come to distribute the royalties, there's no reason why they shouldn't be done on some world pattern which would embrace the heritage of man concept.
Right.
Perhaps just 2 points. One, first of all, the common heritage already applies for the scientific information. All the information gathered at present goes into the international data network and is available for all mankind to use. The other thing is with regards to the minerals or other resources that may exist in the Antarctic, their value would be very small compared to the scientific information obtained. In other words, if you can find scientific information for principles that allow you to discover 1,000 oil fields or minerals in other areas, then that will be much more valuable than isolated little deposits found in the small 2% of the rock in Antarctica itself. So it's that science that is the value.
Fine.
David, if I may,
Please, yes.
listening to the interesting discussion between Paul and Phillip Law, it seems to me that there's a little analogy to the law of the sea here. There are many areas in the Antarctic which are, quote, non-controversial, and in which there's a wide area of agreement and will to cooperate. The question of minerals and the environment, that conflict area, it would be a great pity if that sort of clouded the progress that can be otherwise made. And therefore I believe, we should keep options open. There is a moratorium on mineral work at present, and that probably should continue for quite a long while. Economically, it makes sense to keep a moratorium on, which then allows study of the environmental questions, the geology, the possibility of mineral development being kept in mind, so that we can probably proceed in a cooperative way rather than have this confrontational problem that might otherwise develop and vitiate the goodwill in the treaty.
Okay, it really is time to wrap this up, I think, at this stage. Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting discussion. I've enjoyed this immensely, found it most useful. I think there's no doubt that the questions relating to the future of the Antarctic are very complex, and it's also clear that the nature of the Antarctic itself is as yet still poorly understood. We have, as a planet, as occupants of a planet, some time up our sleeves yet until the crunch comes, until we face our major energy crisis, and I think it's a very good thing that this spirit of enlightened debate should pervade discussions on the future of this last wilderness.